In this video, I'll be explaining every type of aesthetic. If you don't know what an aesthetic is, it's basically a collection of colors, imagery, objects, or fashion that all convey a similar emotion. You might have heard of the term core, which is basically a suffix used to describe anything that is similar in some way and that is grouped together to convey a certain meaning. So to make this video easier, I've categorized each of these aesthetics into 9 categories, starting with academia aesthetics. As the name suggests, these aesthetics are all centered around the love of learning and knowledge, starting off with dark academia. So dark academia is all about learning and knowledge and self-discovery, but with a very moody and dark tone to it. It mainly uses dark earth tones like brown, black, and beige, and basically romanticizes the 19th century academic lifestyle in Europe. I think a good example of this would be Harry Potter. Now next up, if dark academia was too dark for you, we have light academia. They're pretty much the same thing, except of course light academia has a lighter color palette. And also, while dark academia focuses on things like tragedy, death, and existentialism, light academia focuses on more positive themes like friendship and happiness. Moving on, we have art academia, which revolves around the love of creating art. So if the other academia aesthetics are about studying the academics, then art academia is about studying art. So it includes a lot of anatomy drawings or life drawing or those studies of different objects or figures. Next up, we have chaotic academia, which goes against the kind of prim and proper academia by pointing out how pretentious and elitist it is. It's all about embracing the messy and imperfect lifestyle that many students have and encourages just having fun and being yourself. Chaotic academia rebels against this very traditional style of education and promotes just being human. And finally, we have pastel academia. I think instead of explaining this one, let's just go straight to the creator. I'm here with
Mama.
She's the creator of pastel academia. What? What is pastel academia?
Pastel academia is an aesthetic, basically. It's mostly derived from light academia, but it's more, instead of neutral tones and earthy tones, it's more pastel and more like colorful in a way, but like toned down. Like, if you look to other academia aesthetics, they're more so like Eurocentric in a way. And pastel academia is more of an Asian-centered aesthetic. Like, it takes inspiration from Japanese, Korean, and other East Asian cultures in the way of their academia. So that's what it is essentially. So it was during like senior year, and I was very bored with my life. And in my high school, I kind of dressed differently from everyone. But I was like, you know what? Let me just take this facet of my personality and like make it worth something. So I sat and I was like scrolling through aesthetics, and I was like, this is so awesome. Like, why isn't there an academia that's like pastel and like girly and like fun like that? So I was just like, let me make it. Like, why not? I ended up creating a page on the wiki that was titled Pastel Academia, and I expected it to go nowhere, but it went places. Like, I fully like, I know I saw someone like reposted a thing where this lady in the UK opened up a whole store that's just like pastel academia. No, like I feel like she's a really sweet lady who runs. Like, I did reach out to her and I told her like, hey, like, I created this aesthetic. I think it's really cool that you did this. And she was like, wow, it's such an honor. This is so cool. Like, how far like me being bored during my senior year has come to this whole like culture almost. But like, as of right now, I don't really follow the aesthetic. Like I have a really different opinion on aesthetics than I did when I started. So it's very...
And moving on to the next one. Yeah. Whatever it is. I forgot.
Yay!
Now moving on to our next category, we have fashion aesthetics. I think the name is pretty self-explanatory, so let's just begin. Starting off, we have ABG, which stands for Asian Baby Girls. This term originated from Asian American gangsters from the 80s and 90s and was associated with violence, drugs, and overall trashiness. But nowadays, ABGs are a popular fashion and makeup style used by Asian American girls who want to rebel against typical Asian stereotypes. ABGs will typically have large hoop earrings, koi fish tattoos, false lashes, blonde hair, baggy sweatpants. And of course, you can't forget about boba. By the way, if you're curious, the male version is basically the same thing, except they probably have gold chains, flannels, a perm. Their favorite artist is Keshi, and their name is Kevin Nguyen. Next up, we have old money, which refers to generationally wealthy upper-class families that became rich a long time ago and passed down that wealth down their lineage. This aesthetic got pretty popular recently as sort of a rejection of, the modern new money billionaire influencer looks. I think many people are just sick of, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and we're drawn to a more traditional style. Like many other aesthetics on this list, old money is a desire for nostalgia and simpler times, especially after the instability caused by the pandemic. Another feminine group of aesthetics is softy, which is centered around dressing as cute as possible. We have soft girl, which is about looking very feminine with pastel colors and stuffed animals. We have soft baddie, which leans more towards sexy and mature. You may also know it as girl crush, as some celebrities with this aesthetic include Ariana Grande, Twice, or Blackpink. Moving over, we have avant-garde, which is a French term translating to things that are ahead of its time. So these are things that are not currently popular or really widely accepted yet. It can describe art movements like Dadaism, or just anything that's pushing the boundaries and cutting edge or innovative. But I think most people associate avant-garde with those really weird and wacky high fashion runway outfits. Dorpcore is where people try to dress as functional as possible, basically wearing things that are strictly utilitarian rather than aesthetic. So some Dorpcore brands include Arc'teryx, Patagonia, and the North Face. Similarly, techwear is all about dressing as functional and fashionable as possible. The main difference from Dorpcore is that techwear takes on a more futuristic cyberpunk theme to it. Then we have e-boys and e-girls, which is a style that mainly uses dark colors. People will typically wear chains, have dyed hair, middle parts, and tattoos. Next up, we have Acubi, which is a trend originating from the Korean brand, the Acubi Club. Just gonna interrupt here. It's actually pronounced Acubi, not Acubi. It basically combines Y2K along with minimalism. So it takes some Y2K styles like graphic tees and muted colors like blue and green, as well as patterns and ripped jeans and baggy clothing. But it also takes some minimalist aspects as it maintains a very simple silhouette and avoids very busy patterns and a lot of chunky jewelry. And finally, we have Mori-Kei, which is a Japanese fashion trend that's all about dressing as if you live in the forest. I know that sounds kind of unappealing, but it actually takes on this very mystical fantasy fairy theme to it. So that's it for fashion aesthetics. Let's move on to design aesthetics. Let's start with everyone's favorite, Y2K. Y2K was popular in the 90s and early 2000s, mainly influenced by the optimism surrounding the new millennium and innovations in technology. Y2K is characterized by these really shiny, blobby shapes, which can be seen in things all the way from architecture to user interfaces. Y2K shares some similarities to Vaporwave in the form of angst towards late-stage capitalism and a nostalgia for a future that never came. This aesthetic has made a huge comeback recently because, like I said, after the pandemic, I think a lot of people are more nostalgic towards simpler times. Moving on, we have abstract tech, which are these designs from the early 2000s that try to be as technologically advanced as possible. Corporate Memphis recently got pretty popular, or I should say controversial. It's basically those minimalist corporate illustrations that every company uses nowadays. It all started with Facebook, but then ever since all the tech companies just follow them because of just how inoffensive and easy to produce these are. Next, we have Frutiger Arrow. I think we're all familiar with this aesthetic, but I don't think many people know the name for it. Frutiger Arrow was a design trend from the early 2000s up until the early 2010s, and is known for its use of skeuomorphism, the concept of making digital icons resemble their real-life counterparts. It has many similarities to Y2K through its use of gradients and 3D elements, but Frutiger in general has a more kind of refreshing and optimistic feeling to it, symbolizing the rise of the information age and the positive outlook on future technology. Flat design is a design trend that became popular in the mid-2010s after Fruitiger Arrow. It basically had the goal of reducing visual load and being more accessible. Flat design actually goes back as far as the 1920s through the Bauhaus, as well as to the 1950s through the Swiss style, and then it emerged again in the 80s and 90s through Memphis. And today flat design is arguably more prevalent than ever, so much so that I think people are starting to get sick of it. Imaginarium tries to picture what our imagination looks like by creating these very surreal, photoshopped images. They typically depict this dreamlike world where objects and animals are placed in a way that wouldn't be possible in real life. And finally, we have Vectorbloom, which was a style popular in the 2010s, characterized by these translucent floral patterns tied with round sans serif fonts and colorful gradients. It was used quite commonly in interior design. I'm sure we've all been in that one building or restaurant that uses Vectorbloom designs all over it. And that concludes design aesthetics. Let's move on to internet and media aesthetics. So these are aesthetics that originate or are mostly prevalent online, or are just associated with mainstream media in general. First off, we have liminal space, which are low quality images depicting empty places like abandoned malls, suburban neighborhoods, parking lots, and just outdated architecture in general. Aside from nostalgia, these images evoke a strong feeling of fear and loneliness, as if you're the last person on Earth. You'll typically find these in YouTube videos titled strangely familiar images with unsettling music. So this aesthetic has since evolved into the genre called the backrooms, which is an alternate universe full of infinite empty hallways that people can no-clip into at any time. I feel like this is the pinnacle of liminal spaces, as it directly speaks to the idea of an empty, abandoned place that feels familiar but is also hostile. Next up, we have a more well-known aesthetic, lo-fi. This aesthetic can be traced back to musicians like Jay Dilla and Nujabes, who are the first to play intentionally low-fidelity music. And today, most people associate lo-fi with the Lo-Fi Girl, which is a YouTube channel that live streams music 24/7. It uses a lot of vintage filters and imagery as well as from Japanese culture, as lo-fi is associated with the 60s and 70s, back when Japan was having a cultural boom. Next up, we have vaporwave, which is characterized by its use of 80s and 90s pop culture imagery, glitch art, and a nostalgic, dreamy atmosphere. It features bright neon colors, Greek or Roman statues, Japanese text and graphics, and distorted or pixelated images. Vaporwave is often associated with critiques of consumerism, capitalism, and the commodification of culture, as well as just a nostalgia for a simpler time. I think that vaporwave tends to appeal to millennials in the same way that Y2K appeals to Gen Z. Next up, we have MTV Green Sky, which refers to those early 2000s music videos where they made everything look super green. You can even see this in movies like The Matrix. So apparently this was a result of digital color grading becoming more widely accessible, allowing more editors to make their films look futuristic easily. Next up, we have Bastardcore, which is basically just cursed images. So basically these are images that trigger your fight or flight response and are designed to be as uncomfortable as possible. Then we have McBling, which was an aesthetic that rose to popularity after Y2K. So McBling is basically associated with these really bad paparazzi photos of celebrities right after some sort of scandal. Probably involves Britney Spears or something like that. I think some movies or shows that embody this aesthetic are Mean Girls and Legally Blonde. So the next aesthetic is kawaii, which is a Japanese term meaning anything childlike. A subgenre of kawaii is kawaii gamer, which is, you know, exactly how it sounds. And we have darkcore, which depicts these dark rooms and hallways and empty places, usually containing some sort of creepy shadowy figure. But opposite to darkcore, we have lightcore, where instead of using darkness to convey fear, it uses light. I find this one quite interesting because instead of using our traditional irrational fears of the dark, it makes us question where these lights are coming from and like what's powering them in the first place. Moving on to dreamcore, which uses a lot of surreal imagery to give a feeling of a weird dream. A lot of times it'll use liminal space imagery but add some strange elements to it like rainbows, eyes, sparkles, or clouds. Weirdcore is very similar but gives off the feeling of dread and loneliness. It's heavily influenced by imagery from old computers and amateur photography from the early 2000s. There's usually some sort of text that says something very vague and unnerving, seemingly out of context and leaving the viewer to interpret it. Old web is an aesthetic based on design elements from computers and the internet from the 90s and early 2000s. And that's all for internet and media aesthetics. Moving on to our next category, which are lifestyle aesthetics. So these are aesthetics based on a certain lifestyle, stage in our lives, or encourages a certain way of living. Starting off, we have 1950s suburbia. So basically after World War II, a bunch of people started having babies, and the US was like, crap, we need to build houses. So they began this very unique style of suburban development where these mass-produced houses were built on the edge of cities. The very first suburb ever created was Levittown in New York, and to get people to move to these suburbs, the government created a lot of propaganda basically. They created this very idealized image of the suburbs, this friendly neighborhood where everyone looked and thought the exact same and we're all happy. So basically this aesthetic encapsulates this utopian vision of American suburbia, which you might know it as the American dream.
This is the American dream.
Moving on, we have minimalism, which is basically about getting rid of everything you don't need and only keeping the bare essentials. It was a popular lifestyle trend in the late 2010s that went against consumerism and encouraged a more simple and focused way of living. I think the trend and the kind of philosophy behind it and the kind of way of living has since died down, but I think people are still appealed to the overall simple and decluttered aesthetic of it. Next up, we have bougie, which is short for the French term bourgeoisie, which basically just describes anything rich and fancy and high class and wealthy. Moving on, we have cottagecore, which romanticizes country farm life, or more specifically, the English countryside from the Victorian era. It really values having a very simple, traditional lifestyle away from modernity. Earthcore is all about saving the environment and appreciating nature. It's often associated with granola girls, whereas many people call it modern day hippies. But they're just people who tend to be more eco-conscious and spiritual, or just enjoy the outdoors. The indie aesthetic is all about embracing a very simple, vintage, and this DIY lifestyle. Fashion typically includes relaxed fitting clothes like sweaters and vintage tees, tennis shoes and flannels, and of course jeans, which I think vintage jeans are like the primary staple of the indie aesthetic. The attitude behind this aesthetic is all about being authentic and creative, rebellious. After all, indie is short for independent. Kidcore basically brings back childhood memories from the 70s all the way to the 2000s, and similar to that we have late 2000s elementary school, which not really much to explain here. Plant moms are people who just really like flowers and plants. Alright, moving on to our next category, stereotype aesthetic. Starting off with Americana, which are basically just bunch of music, artifacts, object, and material culture that are seen as American. So think of things like the American flag, football, fast food, suburbs, cowboys, and the 4th of July. High School Dream portrays a very nostalgic view on American high school life. It basically just encapsulates all the typical American high school cliches. The preppy aesthetic is based on old private preparatory schools in the Northeast US, and is heavily influenced by upper-class fashion, mannerism, and etiquette. Finally, we have VSCO, which is a popular app that allows users to easily edit their photos with a bunch of filters and tools. The app has since become associated with a specific kind of Gen Z girl. If you're a VSCO girl, you probably like taking pictures of sunsets, putting Polaroids or postcards on your wall, and decorating your bags with pins or stickers. And moving on over to the next category, which are psychological aesthetics. Cleancore is all about, of course, being clean. This aesthetic is pretty popular among people with anxiety over germs and dirtiness. I think a lot of it also has to do with the pandemic, where we really started paying attention to sanitization and cleanliness. Medicalcore uses medical imagery, usually from hospitals, in a very surreal and cute way. It's mainly used as a coping mechanism for those who may have suffered some sort of traumatic injury or condition. Trauma core is very similar to medical core in that it helps people cope with some sort of traumatic event from their childhood or their past. It's this sort of art form that people create in order to put their feelings out into visual form. And because a lot of abuse takes place during childhood, trauma core involves a lot of childhood imagery like cartoon characters or images of childhood homes or schools. Happy core is also about coping with trauma, but with a more positive theme to it. It contains more light-hearted imagery and text that tries to motivate the viewer to get better. And that concludes this category. Let's move on to our final category, which are fiction genre aesthetics. Analog horror uses TV broadcasts, emergency alert systems, or VHS tapes to create horror. It replicates film technology from the late 1900s, back when graphics were low quality and glitchy. Examples of this include Five Nights at Freddy's, or those Backrooms found footage videos, or those fake EAS scenarios. Next up we have cyberpunk, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, especially if you watched Blade Runner or played the cyberpunk games. It basically depicts this idea of a mega futuristic city full of super tall skyscrapers with neon lights and has a very dark and realistic tone to it. It's often used as social commentary to highlight issues surrounding class inequality and capitalism, and kind of tries to depict a dystopian vision for our current future. Finally, we have retrofuturism, which is basically what people from the past thought the future would look like, and usually their predictions are based on the technology that they had back then, which I think is interesting because it kind of shows that the predictions that we're making about our future is probably just as inaccurate. And that concludes all the aesthetics for this video. Let me know what your favorite aesthetic was, or which one you think represents you the most. Now, I know I didn't mention every single aesthetic, but there are hundreds and hundreds of them, so there's no way I can talk about every single one in this video. But let me know if you want a part 2 of this video where I go into the other ones I didn't mention. Be sure to check out the aesthetics wiki, which has an article on pretty much every single aesthetic that has ever been conceived of. But anyways, goodbye.